Call the meeting to order of the President and Board of Trustees. Roll call.
Trustee Peck. Trustee Rasich.
Here.
Trustee Wajowski.
Here.
Trustee Benucci.
Here.
Trustee Lamb.
Here.
Trustee O'Rourke.
Here.
Mayor Collins.
Here, if you could rise for the pledge.
This time we're seeking approval, a motion to approve the minutes of the Committee of the Whole workshop held on September the 28th.
So moved.
There we are. Trustee Peck's not here. Trustee Rasich.
Yes.
Trustee Wajowski.
Yes.
Trustee Benucci.
Yes.
Trustee Lamb.
Here. Yes.
Trustee O'Rourke.
Yes.
So-
Trustee Peck is here.
Oh, Trustee Peck just arrived. Motion to approve the minutes.
Yes.
Thank you. Presidential comments.
The only one I have, it's 5-2 in the bottom of the fifth. And that's all I have.
Cubs, I hope. Good.
Important variable.
Trustee comments.
I just had maybe sorry. Just a question for Alan more than anything. Just curious on the update for the snowplow, or for the winter plan for the snowplowing.
Well, I'll make this very, very brief. Actually, today is Columbus Day. We're open for business where a lot of the governmental entities are shut down. And we put in an order for 1,000 tons of salt, which was supposed to be delivered over about a 2-week period. They delivered about 700 tons today because most of the other municipalities were closed, and they called very early in the morning. They asked if we were open. They asked if we could stay a little late, and they asked how many trucks they could bring, and we said bring as many as you can. So we're doing well on salt, and we'll get the remainder of our salt. The snowplow bids, applications are out. They're not bids, they're applications for contractors. We've had 12 different contractors pick up. Many have resubmitted. We'll evaluate those, bring those back to the board, either at the next regular board meeting, or if it takes time to properly evaluate the contractors, it'll be the first meeting in November.
I'm sorry, just to expand a little bit. Part of the discussion early on was to kind of look back at last year, see what maybe went right, what didn't go so right, and what plans were changing or adjusting for this year, correct? Will that be part of that whole discussion, or?
We can include that level of detail, but in essence, the contracts have changed and have improved too as well. I anticipate we will get newer, larger, more capable contractors. Also, our intergovernmental agreements with the townships, Wheatland and Plainfield Township, will help greatly too, as well as far as response. We have 3 new units, new snowplows that will be on the street too as well, and changing up the schedule will also help too as well. But I'll be happy to go over that, but that's in essence the outline.
Thank you.
Are there any other trustee comments?
Just one clarification, Alan, just as far as the RFP goes and everything, is there gonna be, or is there language that does dissertate some sort of a penalty if the response time is not up to par with our expectations, so that way the contractors know if they show up 24 hours late, they're gonna make X% less on those billable hours?
Well, there is some strong language in there as far as performance is concerned, as far as performance review is concerned too as well, and as far as what the village pays for as far as acceptable work. So, you know, I wouldn't call it a quote-unquote penalty, because in a contract like this, you have to offer a bonus, and I don't think the village is prepared to offer bonuses for snow removal work. But there's strong language in there to take.
Okay, so it sounds like you have that issue addressed and that it'll be enforceable and something that's measurable.
Yes,
Excellent.
that's correct.
Thank you, Alan.
That's correct.
Are there any other trustee comments? Any other trustee comments? Seeing none, public comments? Public comments. Fellas? All right, moving on. Well, this is time now for our workshop to begin. Let me kick it off before we turn this over to Mrs. Pleckham. Tracy's going to take you through history and some projections on a global scale of our revenues and expenses, just to give you a sense of where we have been and where we see ourselves going. In the upcoming committee of the whole meetings, the department heads will make presentations on their individual departments and get into a much greater detail. Tonight is more a global picture, just to present kind of a sense of where we have been and as is our conservative nature, where Tracy and I are kind of projecting our expenses and revenues to be. And again, I do just want to point out that we have been conservative in our estimates in the last number of years and have outperformed our budget estimates in the last 5 years for sure. We also wanted to have just a global conversation with regard to where we are on staffing at this point. We currently have 135.5 full-time equivalent positions with the village. That's approximately 33 staff less than where we were at our highest point. The staff a few years ago, at the direction of the village board, identified where we thought we had some gaps in staffing levels, and at that time identified a shortfall of about 13 positions. We have picked up a few of those positions since that was identified. We have picked up 3.5 positions since then. And we wanted to have a conversation with the board with regard to any additional staffing levels that we might want to take a look at. Conservatively speaking, Tracy and I feel pretty comfortable with a recommendation to you of adding approximately 3 staff members this year. If you're comfortable going in that direction, and we'd like to see if there's some feedback in that particular regard, we'll pick that up at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy, and we'll continue the conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. Like Brian said, what I'd like to do is go through some historical numbers, some perspectives on our revenues and expenditures for just our operating fund, our general corporate fund. What you have in your packet is what you'll see on the screen. The first slide that you see is really in fiscal 16, which is what we're in now. Our overall revenues are at $22.5 million. And what comprises that the most is our state of Illinois taxes at 42%. About $9.5 million is coming through the state of Illinois or from the state of Illinois in some way, shape, or form. We'll get into that in a little more detail. And the second highest revenue source is through property taxes, 22%. And that's about just under $5 million budgeted for this fiscal year. The third largest, and which is really the third most substantial, the rest of the revenue sources are smaller in nature, are charges for services, and that's primarily our refuse collection revenues that we take in, which gets passed through primarily to waste management. So although it is a revenue source for the village, it really offsets the cost of refuse collection. So I wanted to point that out as well. Now that first slide, or this first slide, shows state of Illinois taxes at 42%. This slide breaks that down a little bit more for you, so you understand where that 42% is coming from. The good news is over half of that is coming from our sales tax, our 1% sales tax that comes from the local businesses within the village of Plainfield. We've budgeted about $5 million this fiscal year for that. Last fiscal year, in 2015, we were at $5 million, $5,025,000 to be exact, is what came in as revenues. So that's half of those state revenues that you see within that prior slide. The second largest would be our income tax. This is the one that we've been talking about for over the last year or more. It's over 33% of our revenues within this particular category, just over $3 million. What was budgeted for 16 is actually a 17% reduction to 2015's numbers. So we have put a conservative stop into our current budget in the event the state decides to make some change within the state income tax revenue sharing that we have at the village level. So we do have some of that in place, just in the event that something should happen with the budget impasse that's going on at the state level. The local use tax, which is only 7% of revenues, I wanted to point out, though, that we are currently delayed in receiving those funds. The last funds we received was in August, but it was for June revenues, and that's because the budget has not been passed yet. So we have received no funds from the state for the use tax, and it's roughly, well, it's right around $60,000 a month. So we're watching that closely, but until the budget is taken care of at the state level, they were withholding those funds at the local level. The highest percentage of that state revenue is the sales tax, as I said. Back in 2009, the village received about just over $4 million in sales tax revenue. And again, in 2015, we were just over $5 million. 2016 is budgeted right around the same. The increase within the last few years has been about 3% a year in sales tax revenue increase to the village. From 2009 to 2013, the increase was almost 14%. That kind of goes to what the economy was doing at the time and where the village was at the time as far as sales tax revenues are concerned. So we're seeing pretty much a steady sales tax revenue, 2 to 3% increase from year to year. That's based on certain growth within the community as well as just spending, consumer spending as well. The other piece that was the second largest revenue source for the village is the property tax revenue. I put this slide on here to show that our revenue history has been relatively stable. Interestingly enough, it's driven obviously on the rate in EAV. The rate for the village has been constant since 2012. It's been maintained at the same rate. Our EAV, or the assessed value that's calculated for what the village receives, has actually gone up 2% this last year between 13 and 14. Levy year 14 collected in 15. The last prior 2 years have actually been reduced 2.5 and 5, and just over 5%, although our revenue stream has been relatively the same for the last few years. Pretty consistent revenue source, staying at about 22%. And I know that we'll have levy conversations in the next month or so in regards to the next fiscal year budget and the levy. That has to be approved by the end of this December, but wanted to show the slide just to remind the board where we're at with our property tax revenues for the village. This slide I'd like to add on here because I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of where we were and where we are today. And actually, I should have added one more year to this. It just wouldn't have made the picture as readable, so I had to take out 2006. But in 2006, building permit revenue alone was $6.3 million. 2007, it dropped to just that $3.3 million number that you see there on the screen. And it went as low in 2011 to $275,000. So when we talk about, and we've talked about time and time again, what happened with the revenues in our corporate fund, 40% was coming from permit revenues, which was at one point over $6 million of our general fund. We've diversed, with some of our revenue streams at this point. So right now, this is permit revenues globally. This is just building permit revenues, but permit revenues globally within the corporate fund is just over 3%. 3.9, I believe, is what the revenue source is. That includes building permits and some other smaller revenue sources and license and permits. So it's been a big change in the operation side of things. Obviously, staff does not think that we'll get back to that even the $3 million level in the permit revenues. So this is just a slide we'd like to show to see where we were at the time we had the housing issues back in 2008, 2007. This slide is just showing where we've been in expenses for the last few years. With the audit being approved last Monday, we were able to include the actual numbers in fiscal 15. And primarily, the next two slides will show salaries and benefits comprise the bulk of the expenditures within our corporate fund. It's just over 65%. In the contractual services, which you see there at 26%, just over $3 million is refuse collection related. So there are contractual services that we engage in other than refuse collection, obviously between the streets division and all the other divisions, but just over $3 million is comprised within that just over $5 million number that you see. This is just the same information shown on a different picture, so you can see salary and benefits again right around that 65%, just rounded up, and then contractual services being the third largest piece of the pie. This is the overall revenue and expense summary for the last few fiscal years. And at the bottom, which is what you'll see reflected within the audit, is where our surplus or deficit has been for the past few years. And primarily, and we just talked about this at the last board meeting in fiscal 15, the actual, we did show that we had a deficit of $1.5 million, but as you can see, there was a $3.2 million transfer that went to our capital fund to bring up that fund balance within our capital fund, which was at that $12 million deficit at one point in time. So the last 2 years actually have had those transfers moving to the village's capital fund in compliance with the financial policies that we have in place. But as far as revenues and expenditures are concerned, our revenues are generally right around 20 to 22 million. Our expenditures at this point, not including transfers, are right around $20 million. The other slide I'd like to add is where our fund balance is, and we talk about our fund balance. This slide shows unrestricted fund balance, meaning money that that can be used for anything. It's not reserved for any specific project or purpose within the audit, as a percent of what is spent within our general fund on a fiscal year. So back in 2009, our general fund unrestricted fund balance was just over 13%. In 2015, this slide is reflective of 49%. We have some funds that are reserved, which is not considered restricted. It's still considered unrestricted for health insurance purposes. If you look at what we consider as reserved, we're at 40% fund balance currently in our audit. And that's because the health insurance we consider more of a restricted fund, even though from an audit perspective they consider it still unrestricted. So that's why if you're looking at the slide, it looks a little different. But right now we're keeping that 40%. If you look in the financial policies, anything over 40%, the village may transfer to the capital fund to help replenish that fund, and that's what happened the last 2 years. So where are we today? I pulled the information up as we review this. I review this quite often, but through September 30th, which is just being finished now for the board to review at the next board meeting, it's 42% of the fiscal year. We're at 59% of revenues and 38% of expenditures. The revenues, the property tax revenues are pretty much at 100%. There's some miscellaneous late payments that will be coming in for property taxes, but generally speaking, we're at 100% for property tax revenues, and everything else is right on target. And I added a column. I looked at last year at the same time, and it is almost identical to where we are today. So very consistent in nature. I had to bring up, though, and if you question it, the streets department looks a little higher last year, and that's only because we bought our salt already and had to pay for it, and it had been already approved through the board. So that's the only difference, really, that was of any major difference between this year and last year. But overall, we're running almost identical to where we were last year, which is very good and very consistent, and we're comfortable with that at the staff level. As we do and as we show within our budget document from year to year, we do have a fiscal year forecast that we like to look at. Very conservative forecast by nature, but as we see, without any staffing additions and very conservative numbers on the revenue side, we are looking at pretty much a straight line revenue expenditure budget for the next 4 years. Understanding where we've been the last few years, our performance has been relatively good as it relates to the audit, so we never want to overestimate where we think we'll be. And with the state uncertainty, we always want to make sure that we're looking at these numbers in a little more conservative nature. So this is what's been put together with slight increases as it relates to salary and benefits, knowing what's happening in the marketplace in the health insurance world. So those have been added within this forecast. No new staffing has been added at this point in time in what we're looking at, but wanted to start the conversation as it relates to the fiscal 17 budget, which we're kicking off tonight, and any staffing discussions that we need to look at as far as moving forward with the fiscal 17 budget. Bless you. Relating to staffing, Brian mentioned earlier, this chart, which is in our fiscal budget from year to year, reflects the staffing positions that we've had since fiscal year 8. We were up to 168 employees, full-time equivalent employees, back in 2008 fiscal year. And in this current budget, we are budgeted for 135 and a half employees. We've gone as low as 126, if you notice, in 2011, and it breaks it down by division. Community development includes both planning and building, and the rest are pretty self-explanatory. Now, with that, I think that we'd like to open up the floor for any questions that the board might have and any more comments related to what Brian talked about in the beginning of the presentation in regards to the 17 budget.
Right, to pick up where I left off in the introduction, as Tracy showed, we currently are sitting at 135 and a half full-time equivalent positions. As we were taking a look at where we stand as compared to the original assessment by the staff a couple of years ago, we recognized as staff the possibility that we could take on 3 additional staff positions in this upcoming year. The 3 that we identified would be 2 in the police department. As you know, we have not added any sworn officers since we've laid off 3 officers back in, back after the 2009 crisis. As well as we've been talking about for quite some time, we'd like to add on an economic development specialist position with some duties assigned to that person that would also help in the planning department to take the load off of Michael and Jonathan. Those 3 seem to be the lowest hanging fruit and, more importantly, very much a priority. With regard to what Michael and Jonathan are seeing, we're seeing additional demands on them just with plan reviews that are coming in. Michael, Jonathan, myself, and Amy have basically played the role of economic development specialists on behalf of the village. However, we haven't been giving it necessarily a single priority, and we're seeing now that the economy is beginning to grow a little bit more, that might be a very good place for us to go. As well, then, with those additional plans that Michael and Jonathan are seeing, it seems that it'd be a very good fit to have that person take on additional responsibilities with regard to historic preservation, TIF, and other business planning type functions that we have going with the planning department. With the police department, if you were paying attention the last little bit with regard to what's going on there, John's done Chief's done a fantastic job at managing the staff that he has. However, with the additional community events that we have going on and with additional pressures to essentially make sure that our employees actually do take time off, which has been a bit of a struggle for us. As you recall, that is the only thing we were actually written up for in our audit. John's overtime budget has been rather high this past summer. We expect it will drop down a little bit. However, he still does have some additional costs there, and largely it has to do with the fact that we aren't at full staffing in his department. Where we aren't in full staffing, as you know, we've pulled back a lot of the traffic division functions, and John will be able to speak to those as we go in and present his particular department. But those were the high-level points that I wanted to hit on with you. See if there's any thoughts or feedback or questions that you might have. I'm not expecting a yes or no answer necessarily on those positions. I more wanted to put it out there for your thought and consideration and thoughtful remarks as we go through the entire budget process. So Tracy and I would be happy to answer any questions you have on the larger global picture.
You know, with staffing, Mr. Murphy?
Go ahead, sir.
No, I'm sorry, you were consulting with the mayor. You know, in regard to the staffing, the one particular area that I really see a tremendous need is that you had mentioned, I know there's always the need in the police department, but in our planning department with Mr. Garrigan and Mr. Prue, those 2 individuals are, if one could say, overworked, overburdened, and out-resourced, and totally, they need help. I go into that department on a regular basis. They're working very diligently, and they do have to wear entirely too many hats. If I was to put a particular vote in one of these 3 positions that are available, I would demand that, not demand, but I would request that one be placed in our planning department for economic development and for assistance in just general planning when people come in and want to present a project to our village. So that would be one of my positions of the 3. Thank you.
I would certainly agree with that. Michael's made his presentation a number of times, and I've always said that it's like a 4-man job that you're laying out for the next year, and you got 2 of you. So some help would certainly be beneficial if you're going to be able to accomplish as many things as I'm sure you'd like to. However, I'd like to emphasize what Chief Konopek said a year ago. Retirements and getting prepared, it takes a year to get a new person on board for training and all that. And so I would place a very high priority on maintaining the level that you have. We need to make that change, support you this year. Didn't get it last year, but this year I would make sure that you got it. So I'm all for that. I have some other comments on the other part of the presentation, but anybody else wants to talk about people, that's fine.
I'd be happy to touch on that. I agree with what I've heard from the other board members, and I appreciate Administrator Murphy and Chief bringing these ideas forward. I do think operationally, though, it would be to our benefit to bring all three of these positions forward, as long as we have funding for them, which it sounds like we do have funding. And in regards to the economic development position, I do believe that individual, whether he or she does come on board, they can pay for themselves. And when I say that, when we have an individual that specializes and utilizing things such as the Buxton study that we participated in and had go out and look for, shortages of a product or a service in our community, when they can take that and go out and harness that information that's gathered, pull in a business that's looking to relocate or open to the village of Plainfield, we are now then generating property taxes on an empty storefront. We're generating sales taxes, and we're creating jobs in Plainfield. That all comes back to us. Maybe not right away, but it does come back to us. So I believe that position is key, but I would prefer that just all three of those positions be filled then moving forward. And I do have other comments, but I'll yield the floor until we're done with the rest of the board discussion. Those three positions. Thank you.
I'm in agreement with the others as far as the economic development. I see progress in the village and the buildings that are going up and the projects that are coming forward, so I think you do need help. As far as the police department goes, I would like to see, if you could, when you have your presentation, the overtime that's high, and if you could define it in which category. Say it's court time versus shift overtime. I'm concerned about the people being overworked. It's a lot of hours, and they work around the clock. Keep in mind, and so the citizenry can see, because these guys and ladies, they work around the clock. Sometimes, you work 16 hours a day. It's not very safe out there when you're forced to work too many hours in a week.
Yeah, and I can say last fiscal year, just in patrol alone, it was almost $360,000 in overtime costs alone.
So what does that compute to average hourly? How many hours in overtime would that be? Okay.
We can pull, I mean, that's absolutely what we would bring back, because it makes a lot of sense.
Because I want to keep our people safe, and I want to make sure that they're well rested enough to be out there driving around these cars.
I was just going to add that traffic control, of all the calls that I get as a trustee, it's traffic control, traffic issues in neighborhoods, because there's only so many police to go around to cover all these areas, and people are mad they get the tickets, and they blame the police to get the tickets, but they're not even trying to slow down at a stop sign, much to stop, and speeding and everything else through the areas. The other one is for planning. I get, as other trustees do, I'm sure, calls on these houses are going up. They're not meeting this annexation agreement. They're not meeting this. They're not using this quality material. So the follow up on that stuff, because you can't be everywhere, and that's what's going on sometimes. That's another reason you need more help in that department as well. So I think that the need is there. I think obviously with the devil's in the details, and what we can afford not, but those are definitely needs that we have.
I would say on the police department, I guess it is, as you were saying, devil's in the details, so I guess it'd be interesting to see Chief's report, but I think what I've seen a little bit, and maybe it's just a piece that I'm taking away, but you look at the miles driven, gallons used, it seems to be decreasing. So my concern is maybe, that the people actually on the street maybe is less. I don't know. That's just a guess. I'm speculating on my part. So certainly if two positions are what's being looked at, if those people end up on the street, I think where they touch and feel, the residents and people see them, I think that's always important. From the economic perspective, certainly I think along with Garrett Peck, Mr. Peck, I think that it does and it can pay for itself. I think there's an outside agency right now. I don't know if that position would be eliminated and rolled into the economic development's responsibilities, so that would potentially save us money there. And then, as you attract a bigger, stronger tax base, then hopefully it's going to potentially pay for itself.
Okay, thank you for that feedback. That'll be very helpful as we continue on with preparing our reports and the like. I know there were a few other questions or comments that were going to be made. Before we go that, I just thought again I'd remind that our schedule is actually 2 weeks from now is the Streets Department. Correct, Alan? Right? I believe so. 4 weeks from now is the Police Department, and peppered between those 2 nights are the other funds, if you will. And I wish I had my sheet right in front of me. I'm leaning on Tracy a little bit for, but those are the 2 big ones that are coming up. We also then will have, what we'd like to do is have another wrap-up in November. The plan is that we will publish for our property tax rate and revenues. That has to be completed by December 31st. The way that the holiday schedules fall in place, we'd like to get that to you at the first meeting in December. So that's kind of what our schedule is at this point. Right, it has to be published in November. We'll have that published, and then we'll have the public hearing and hopefully this vote the same night on the first meeting in December. That way, if there are any other questions or follow-up that we need after that, we still have one more meeting available to us.
And it has to be passed by some.
It has to be passed by a simple majority.
By the last Tuesday in December.
Other comments and questions?
I was asking everyone not to speak tonight, but I have to say one thing. You know, I really appreciate, Tracy, your particular general fund revenues and expenses report. It's really good to get a situation like this. But there was one particular item. It was the building permit revenue history. You don't have to bring it up. Oh, there it is, and she did it. I asked Mr. Murphy, I said, you know, the dates are slipping away from me. I said, when did you arrive? And he said 2009. And I said, was that a wise decision to show up on that particular year, if you look at it? And I said, did you know that was going to happen? He said, no. And I said, would you have come here if you did? He said, absolutely. He said, Plainfield was in my sights forever and ever, and he wanted to work here. And he said, no matter what, that could he told me just a few minutes ago, if that graph went underneath the years, he still would have been here. And I said, was that a shock? In 2009, he said, we're still talking about it. Okay, but thanks for the report.
Any other comments other than Mr. Burkhardt?
Yeah,
I was going to make a comment that there are these stories floating around the entire city manager world that there's this guy named Jim Rasich, and you just had to try to work for him once.
Anyway, go back to the basics. The report's excellent. I think probably, Tracy, when you started, we didn't use revenue to begin the budget process.
Right.
And I keep coming back, if you don't start with revenue, how could you possibly budget? And so
Right.
I applaud the way we're handling it now. You've been doing an outstanding job. The charts show what they are. The one thing that comes up is personnel is usually 80 to 85% of the cost. Contractual services are a wash, right?
Yeah, for the most part, they
We
are
don't
a
make,
wash.
we don't
There's
make
some-
much money. We don't intend to make much money. So
No.
really, yeah, take that out, and then you're
Right.
at the 85%
Right.
range roughly. So people are really what the budget's all about. So we have to be very careful. One thing that's a little misleading, I think, the municipal tax is 2% now?
1.5, but the one that's reflective here, the 5 million, is just the 1%.
Just the 1%?
Just the 1%, and then the home rule sales tax, there's usually 500,000 that's budgeted within our corporate fund operations. Typically, we don't include it at the end of the audit year, depending on performance, and that stays within the capital fund.
It goes there. So
Correct.
we're not losing the home rule sale tax. It's actually going, but it's going to a different pocket.
Correct. Home rule sales tax typically doesn't get put into the corporate fund, correct?
That goes between the capital fund and the water and sewer fund.
Right, right. No, my first budget year was 2007.
Remember. It was interesting, yes. We're doing a far, far better job now, I'll tell you.
Are there any other comments?
I'm sorry, I have a, excuse me, a question. So if I'm understanding, so for 2014, 2015, there was approximately $3 million in transfers, which I'm assuming went, I think you said, to the capital fund?
Correct.
So going forward, those are not in the budget, but yet the budget is, do we not need those transfers any longer, or what's happening there?
The way that the interfunds have worked the last 2 years, basically the auditors come in and audit our records, and the way the financial policies are written, if our fund balance falls above the 40% unreserved, unrestricted amount, we have the ability to move anything above the 40% to capital or transfer it to the capital fund to help offset the position in the capital fund. So it's actually an after fiscal year event that happens during the audit process at this point. So it's not something that we typically will budget for, depending on the performance of the budget for that current fiscal year. If that makes sense.
So I'm sorry, so if we didn't budget for it, and I'm sorry, I'm not an accountant, and then we added the 3 million, did we need the 3 million, or did that just go into kind of the reserves part of it?
It would be in the fund balance reserves if no transfers were made. So prior to the transfer, corporate fund had just about a 49%, over 50% fund balance or higher. And the auditors looked at that and said, your financial policies allow you to transfer up to 40% unrestricted to your capital fund. Is that something that you'd wish to do based on the policies that are in place? And that's when the transfer occurs. It was a combination of expenditures being under, primarily expenditures being under this last fiscal year. Our revenues were pretty online. We had some, the income tax came in a little higher than anticipated, and some of the franchise fees came up, but franchise fees have been up and down the last few years. So most of the experience and the positive experience that we had in our corporate fund last year was expense-based, meaning that we didn't spend as much as we budgeted.
Would you expect that next year as well?
I always hope for that. I think we're running true. We're running true to budget right now, so I would hope that that would be consistent through the year based on what the state does and how hopefully the winter season is. You know, it's a hopeful. The revenues look okay so far. Expenditures are right on line. And we're under. If you looked at the one slide, we are at 59% revenue and 38% expense. Now again, property taxes are in at 100%, but we're still performing well currently. So that's a good sign.
Your projected numbers do not include any new hires or anything?
Not at this
Correct.
point. It includes a little, some escalators in health insurance, which is probably higher than what we would necessarily have. We usually put in about an 8% increase, and we've been about 5%. So, I mean, there's things like that that are put in there because you just don't know. And with the Affordable Care Act coming in, we've added a little bit there. But for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. 1 or 2% increase for utilities, or 3% for this, you know, things like that. But no new staffing at this point. This is the first chance that we've looked at the forecast, so now that we're through almost half of our year this year, we can really look at our history and find out which line item specific that we can look at, and if we're talking about adding staff and taking overtime down a little, or if gasoline was performing better because gas prices are cheaper. Those are the things that we're gonna start looking at if we have direction to start looking at staff additions. That's what will happen.
Great, thank you.
We do expect to see those staff additions covered a little bit by offsetting expenses that we know that we've got some ability to work with based on what we've seen on our trends.
I think the presentation was very well put together. Definitely took a lot of time and effort, and I appreciate all the work staff put into this. If you can bring up the slide with the general fund state revenues real quick on the screen.
This one?
Yes, there is one thing that I'm glad is actually not in there, and it's the video gaming revenue. Because after the article I read last week in the paper, there'd have to be a question mark next to it, and it would probably be red. If you're an accountant, it'd have to be red. You know what, Trustee Rasich, I remember you had mentioned to that, I think it was a lobbyist that was here attempting to twist our arm into implementing video gaming. I think you called it snake oil or snake juice, and you were absolutely right.
Never use that expression.
The one that I'm looking at now possibly would be Ponzi scheme, okay? Now, if, for the trustees that are, newer on the board, when this legislation went through the state, It was Representative Lou Lang that pushed it through. And when communities started opting out, he then threatened communities and said, you know what, we're going to go ahead and take away your capital funds that your community gets from the state if you opt out through legislation. And now they're taking away possibly the revenue from these communities that have now sacrificed revenues from other areas to allow that to come to their communities. So this board was dead on when we decided not to move forward with that. And I'm glad that we don't have to look at this on here tonight and say, are we going to get this or not? So I want to thank the board for that policy decision and thank staff for putting this whole thing together. And also for staff also just to be wary of every single thing that's up there. In the future, they may decrease. Thank you. I yield the floor.
I have a quick question. You made comment about the money's not coming in from the state.
Correct.
At what point are we going to realize that we're starting to hurt and we should use caution on spending and such?
Well, I can chime in a little bit. The use tax on this slide is the portion that we're not receiving currently within our operations. 700, just over 700,000 budgeted. I believe we brought in just about 800,000 last year in revenues for use tax. So at some point in time, if that revenue is not received, we'll see an impact within our revenues this year. Is it detrimental? If it's short term, I would say no. Our motor fuel tax revenue is in the same position. That is where we're spending roughly $1 million a year on road resurfacing to keep our roads up to that PCI or whatever the percentage is for the road program. We have not seen revenues for that as well since the June allotment. And we bring in over about $1 million a year, roughly, if I remember correctly, in MFT revenues. We would talk about that when we bring that budget up. Both of those are important revenue sources for the village. Short term, I think it could be overcome. If it becomes a long-term issue, we'll have to revisit how we're doing our resurfacing program as an example, and then look at our corporate fund on the use tax to see what we would use to offset the loss of revenue.
Just one comment. Your discussion with Trustee O'Rourke brought up our fiscal policies. We've modified it with the time of, we started 5 years ago, I think, if I remember right, and it's an outstanding policy, outlines all the ways that we control things to get to the position where we are now, and that allows us to transfer the funds and so on. But I've recommended before that all municipalities ought to have something like that, and I think ours is a tremendous model. So for those who haven't seen it, I don't know whether you've read it or not, but it's a really nice piece of work, and we've upgraded it a couple times in the last 5 years, and yeah, it's perfect for.
It's within the budget document. We bring it forward on an annual basis, typically in January. We'll see where it falls this year through the budget process. Before the budget is adopted, we'll review that policy and make sure there's no other additions or modifications that need to be made.
Good. Thank you.
Are there any other trustee comments? Any other trustee comments? Last time asking. Seeing none. Right. Seeing none. Reminders.
On October the 14th, will be coffee with the mayor. October 19th, there's the next village board meeting. And our next committee of the whole will be the 26th of October.
We're seeking a motion to adjourn.
A motion to adjourn.
And a second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed, the same sign. We are adjourned at 7:44.